Hi everybody, it's Leela with MISSKISS Kreations. Welcome back to my channel. Today's Tumbler tutorial, I'm going to show you how I created this beginner's white Milky Way tumbler. Like always, all of my materials will be listed in my description below, including direct links and coupon codes. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with this tumbler. And I'm starting with my 20-ounce stainless steel tumbler. I've prepped my tumbler and I've painted it with my pop of color white paint. I let that paint dry, and then we're going to be adding some glitter to the tumbler. I'm using my glitters from Glitter Heart Co., and they will be linked in my description. So I decided to use two colors for this tumbler, and all I'm doing is mixing these glitters together. And then I'm using my wooden stir stick and I'm just stirring them together, and I'm going to lay all of this glitter you see on this cup, well, not all of it, but the combination you see in the cup, on my tumbler. I am applying my glitter using the Mod Podge method, but if you want to use the epoxy method or the spray adhesive method or any method that works for you, go ahead and apply your glitter whichever way is more comfortable for you. So what I usually do is I apply my Mod Podge all over my tumbler. I put a heavy coat on there, making sure I get every piece of my tumbler covered, and then I apply my glitter right from that Dixie cup. I do not add the Mod Podge on the bottom of the tumbler. You're going to see me add that Mod Podge towards the end, because if you see, I'm placing my tumbler right side up whenever I'm placing that glitter back in the Dixie cup. So this is just easier for me to do the bottom last. And once all of my glitter is placed on my tumbler, I do not let my Mod Podge dry. I go right in with my parchment paper, and I'm laying the parchment paper around the tumbler and pressing down firmly with my hands to make sure that all of that glitter sticks nice and flat on the tumbler. This is going to allow me to do less sanding in the future. So the rainbow ice glitter is very fine, and then the snow pearls, that's kind of a chunky glitter. So that's why I decided to use that parchment paper to really lay those glitters flat. You can also take your gloved finger or just your finger and just press down on that tumbler, and pressing down that glitter onto the tumbler, making sure that you're not spreading or moving around that glitter because that Mod Podge is still wet. And then I allow that Mod Podge to dry on the tumbler for about 20 to 25 minutes. Once that is dry, I go in with my Krylon crystal clear acrylic coating. I spray 2 generous coats of this on the tumbler, let that dry for 15 minutes, and then we move on right into epoxy. And since I'm using a 20-ounce tumbler, I am using 20 milliliters of epoxy. That's 10 milliliters part A and 10 milliliters part B, totaling 20 milliliters of epoxy. I am using my fast set epoxy for this step, so this did take about 2 hours to dry to the touch. Make sure you apply that epoxy all over your tumbler so you can get that nice seal with the epoxy. And now that my epoxy is cured on my tumbler, I go in with my sanding blocks. I am first going in with my 220 grit sanding block, and I'm sanding all around my tumbler. You can see I have a little helper that's trying to help. I'm sanding all away those glitters and make sure that the glitters that are poking through that epoxy is sanded down. I want to make sure that this tumbler is as flat and as smooth as possible before moving on with that next step. And then I use my X-Acto knife to clean up the rim of the tumbler. I'm just cutting off any of the paint or the epoxy that may have been placed on that rim. I'm just making sure that rim is nice and clean, because once I finish removing all of this excess epoxy and paint, I'm then going to go in with my 120 grit sanding block and then sand around the rim, making sure that rim is nice, clean. Make sure you have all of the excess paint and the epoxy off so we can go in with that next coat of epoxy. Before I move in with my epoxy, I'm taking my 91% alcohol, wiping down my tumbler with that, just removing any excess oils or sanding dust from my tumbler. And now moving into epoxying my tumbler. So first I'm going to show you the materials I'll be using. I'm using these paints from Hippie Crafter, and these are acrylic paints. These are really fun to work with, and there's really fun colors that they've sent me. So I'm going to have everything linked in my description, and I'm also going to be using some glitter from Glitter Heart Co. just to add an extra bedazzle or bling onto the tumbler. For this step, I mix a total of 30 milliliters of epoxy. So 20 milliliters of epoxy, you're going to see me place all around the tumbler, and then you're going to see me separate the extra epoxy, so those extra 10 milliliters of epoxy, into 3 separate cups. The reason why I'm placing these epoxies, or this amount of epoxy, into 3 separate cups is because I'm adding those acrylic paints into those cups. So however you want to divide your colors into 10 milliliters of epoxy, go ahead and do so. I added more white on this tumbler than I did blue, so I made sure to add less epoxy in my blue cup than I did my 2 white cups. And before I placed my paint into the cups, I went ahead and I used that 20 milliliters of epoxy, and I placed that all over the tumbler. It's going to feel really weird placing all of this epoxy on this tumbler, but you want a nice thick coat of epoxy on this tumbler, because whenever you place those paints and the glitters on the tumbler, you want the tumbler's epoxy to move around, and without all that epoxy on the tumbler, these paints and the glitter won't move around, it won't shift, and it won't create that nice Milky Way effect. So keep applying all of that epoxy onto your tumbler until you have no more epoxy left inside of your cup. And how I like to measure this is, since I'm using a 20-ounce stainless steel tumbler, I'm using 20 milliliters of epoxy. So if you were to be using a 30-ounce stainless steel tumbler, then you would use 30 milliliters of epoxy, and then about 10 to 15 milliliters of epoxy for your extra paint. And once I place that epoxy on the tumbler, I'm now going to place those paints into the epoxy cups, and you can see that small amount of paint I needed to be placed inside of those cups. So you do not need a lot of paint for this, because we're only using a small amount of epoxy. So I'm doing 1 paint at a time. Now keep in mind that epoxy on the tumbler is still wet. I didn't have any time for drying. It's just turning on the tumbler, just wet, no time in between. I want that epoxy to be wet. So when I move on to this step, we get to place all of these paints onto the epoxy, and it's going to flow nicely. Now you can see that I'm adding my diagonal line as best as I can with these paints. So I first start with this titanium white, and I'm just letting the tumbler spin on the turner. I'm not trying to chase the tumbler, and I'm just placing that wooden stick right across that tumbler wherever I want that white to be placed. And it's really hard to see the difference between the titanium white and the metallic white on camera, but the titanium white is a little thicker than the metallic white. So what I'm placing now is a metallic white, and in person you can see the difference. It does give it more depth whenever I added both of these colors. So all I did was I went back and forth with both of these whites until my little heart was happy with how much white I placed on the tumbler. Again, not chasing the tumbler, just letting the tumbler spin and placing that paint wherever I feel necessary. And once I was satisfied with placing the whites on my tumbler, I went in with my blue paint. Now what I'm doing with this is I'm taking my wooden stir stick and I am actually rubbing on that tumbler with that wooden stick. So I'm placing that and I'm kind of smearing it on that tumbler because I don't want much of a line. I just want little strokes or little areas with the blue. So I just wanted that blue to accent that tumbler. So my wooden stick is actually touching that epoxy, and it is okay. Whenever the tumbler turns on the turner, all that epoxy is going to dry smoothly, and it's not going to have an effect with the stick touching that tumbler. So you don't have to worry about any indentions or uneven areas in your epoxy. Once I've added all of my paints, I go in with my heat gun. I am using the high setting on my heat gun from CC DIY, and I am placing a little bit of heat at a time on my tumbler. I don't want to place a lot of heat because I don't want it to be completely swirled around the tumbler. I just want the paints to mess up a little bit. And I place the heat gun about 3 to 5 inches away from the tumbler. After I applied my heat to the tumbler, I decided to let it cool down, so I let it spin on the turner for about 2 minutes, and then I go in with these glitters. So these glitters are also from Glitter Heart Co. I'm using the blue, which is Arctic Mist, and then you're going to see me place She Said Yes. Place these glitters wherever you want to place them. I'm placing the blue in areas where that blue paint was placed, and then I'm going to place that white in the areas where the white paint was placed. And like I always try to remind y'all, these tumblers that I create should just act as an inspiration for y'all. So use as many paint colors you want, as many glitter colors as you want, and place as many or as little glitters as you like on your tumbler. I know you guys are going to create something beautiful. And once I was satisfied with my finished product, I let my tumbler spin on the cup turner for 4 hours. I then turned off my cup turner, let my tumbler air dry or air cure for another 20 hours, allowing my tumbler to completely air dry or air cure for a total of 24 hours. I did not use fast set epoxy for this step because there was a lot of things going on with applying the paint and the glitter, and I really wanted to take my time creating something beautiful, so that's why I decided to just use my regular epoxy for this step. And once my epoxy was cured, I went in with my X-Acto knife again and I cleaned up the rim of my tumbler. After I did that, you can either apply a decal to this tumbler, or if you're not applying a decal, I would highly recommend applying another thin coat of epoxy over your design, just so you can have those glitters locked into your tumbler and you don't have to worry your design coming off of your tumbler. So once I clean up the rim and I clean up the inside, once I epoxied or added my decal, my tumbler was ready to go. And here is the finished design on the tumbler. Guys, this tumbler is so simple and so precious. I absolutely love this. I love to see what you guys create from this inspiration. I want to see what decals you'll decide to put on here or what other colors you'll decide to use. I really hope this tumbler tutorial helped y'all out. And like always, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.